Hello everyone, and welcome to another Imirt Inspire interview. Today's guest is Matt Mortlock. Hi Matt, thank you for joining us.
Not a problem. Good to be here, and thanks for asking me.
Cheers. So Matt, you work for DDM, who probably most people have not heard about. But you'll have a lot of so you kind of have like loads of experience, and your company has loads of experience in kind of the like business dealings of game development.
Yeah, the kind of nuts and bolts. Every single aspect of game development without actually doing any of the development.
All
the behind the scenes stuff leading up to the actual production.
That's the kind of stuff I really want to get into today. So just guys, if you're watching the stream, let me know if there's any issues with the sound or any problems like that. Just let me know in the chat. And if you have questions for Matt, drop them into chat and I will fold them into our talk today. Matt, I kind of want to go back into kind of your personal history a little bit and ask you kind of how you ended up in games and in DDM, I guess, in the end.
Okay, yeah. So I did a course at university. This was a long time ago, so it was before they were really kind of well designed or developed. So I think the one I done was a uni kind of adapted an old computer science. So it was a lot of programming involved.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of certainly a lot more advanced these days. So it probably, it's hard to say whether that got me into the industry or not. So, but it certainly, teaches you a lot of, skills anyway.
So I think it was a really early games-focused course.
Yeah. Very few kind of, design or kind of animation modules in that. It was a lot of hardcore maths actually and programming. So that was kind of a bit of put me off a lot. But I got in the kind of classic route of temping as a QA technician at Codemasters back in, 2005 I think it was. So when I kind of graduated, I had some friends that lived in kind of Leamington near the Midlands way that had done that for summers and stuff, so kind of got in that way and interviewed, got on their books, and then they called me out of the blue one time asking me to come in, and it was like rolling 3-month contract type thing. And at the time, that was when Cody's was prolific. They were doing lots of obviously the racing stuff, but also all sorts of other. They were trying to branch out into action games, and they were making the new Operation Flashpoint and stuff. So
were they also acting as a publisher as well as developing their own stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Publisher anymore, to be honest, and they kind of wisely have become a developer. But back then, they were publishing a lot, obviously their own stuff, and they had a massive development, studio there, probably 500 plus people. I'm not sure if it's as big as it is today, but it was significant. So I started in QA, and then there was an internal opening came up for a games evaluator, which sounds amazing, and it kind of was. It's a great job to have. It was to work with the acquisitions department to look at all the submissions that came in through from various third-party developers, because at the time they were looking at new content to fund and publish. So there was just the two of the guys in there at the time. They couldn't really look at all submissions that came in, so they wanted someone to help just sift through all those submissions and kind of evaluate and get back to the developers and obviously highlight any that were...
Why were they getting so many submissions? Was it something they're inviting, or is it just they're well known?
I think any publisher gets inundated with third-party pitches, just because I don't think it's changed all that much. Obviously the avenues to get to market now are much more prevalent, whereas before it was a lot about securing funding, right, from a publisher to make your game, and it just wasn't that kind of indie scene back then.
And so go far enough back and you needed a publisher even to be on shelves.
Absolutely. There was some that were doing their own thing, had made it, like, I don't know, Worms or something, for instance, which was probably one guy that had a great concept, sold that into Team 17. That's just an example, but now it's, you see it a lot more with small indie teams that can get their game out, and it does, can do very well. But at the time, if you're making quite a reasonable, size AA, AAA game, then you would definitely need some kind of the obvious and logical approach, right?
Yeah, and things have changed a little bit in terms of like publishing and people, tiny teams making games. But we're going to talk a lot more about this about
exactly.
publishing. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting phase we're at, I feel like.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's more power to developers for sure in this day and age, but I think if you're a large studio, you've got a big turnover, right? And you can't go too long without another project. So obviously funding your own development becomes very hard, right, if your overheads are high. And so we still see a lot of, traditional publisher funding as the main source, right, for a lot of our clients in particular, and those wonder developers or projects that really take off on Steam, for example, it maybe makes up 1 or 2%. So it's very small still. You know what I mean? That was the reality. Is you can do it, and the opportunities are there more than ever, probably, if you've got a very good concept and you have a small enough team, so your overheads aren't too high. But it's still hard to get out there, right? So I suppose we can touch on that a bit more, but from there I went into actually the acquisitions department because one of the guys left, and so I moved into there, and then from there I joined DDM. So I was at Cody's probably until 2011, and that was when they were just not really doing much external publishing anymore. You could see that they were
kind of slowed down. Yeah. And was DDM already going then, or were they new?
DDM goes back to 2006, so it was it was quite small back then. It was founded by two guys. One was the actually had run a development studio, Cyberlaw, which done you may remember the classic Playboy Mansion game, and so he came from a very development background, and the other one was a kind of agent. He'd was very much business development, and so those two guys joined forces, and from there into probably about 15 plus people, which doesn't sound like many, but for an agency that's quite a lot. It's probably one of the biggest in regards to that, the amount of people we have that work for us.
So if you want to look them up, everyone, it's ddmagency.com.
Or digital development management. So agencies always seem to have those type of initials.
Yeah. So what is it DDM actually deal with? It seems to me, so I was talking to you before about publishing, and in terms of publishing, it seems like you kind of link kind of developers and publishers together and get deals done, but you do more than that, right?
Yeah, totally. So I think the bread and butter and what most entertainment agencies will do is kind of unearthing opportunities, right, and funding sources. So the bread and butter for us is our representation practice, which is providing development services and support to our development clients, right? So that's looking at what publishers are, what trends are out in the industry, and finding out what publishers are looking for and who is kind of funding projects, because a lot of our clients are looking for project funding, right? So that's kind of like still the bread and butter, and that's where I suppose the majority of the money is kind of generated, because budgets can range from a few million upwards. So that hasn't changed too much over the years. But what we kind of, not me personally, but the sort of the founders and that we're kind of wanting to do is create an agency that would just benefit the industry as a whole, try and improve it, and not be, because I think agents have a misconception of being a bit good kind of agencies, but in the games industry they kind of work behind the scenes an awful lot. Not many people still know about them or really understand what they do.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is a bit of a shame, because it's hard to overcome certain. So
is it a bit like with most people be aware that actors have agents? Is that kind of the model that
Sorry, you just cut over.
Sorry, yeah. Is it a bit like most people be aware that like actors have agents? So it's kind of following that model a little bit?
Yeah, well, they're kind of individuals, so we kind of represent, we don't represent individuals, we represent the team, right, the studio.
Yeah.
But we often work with either kind of some of the senior guys, or they may have their own business development kind of personnel that we liaise with. So we tend to work with, you know, one or two people out of a developer for sure. But, you know, we don't put ourselves front and centre. It's not really about us at all. It's about kind of working behind the scenes, getting the developer to meet with the relevant publisher targets, or just any kind of fund. It doesn't have to be, certainly in this day and age, not just publishing sources anymore. So we maintain, you know, a massive network of contacts with publishers and funding sources, right? But we're kind of often at many trade shows, we're always kind of trying to meet up with people and just getting the lowdown on what their you know, portfolio needs are, or what their funding levels are, right? Trying to identify that, and we can use that intel to help feedback to our clients. And obviously, I think, you know, the best thing to be is to make games you're passionate about, right? Not kind of following trends too much. Obviously, that can help you.
Yeah.
It's interesting to know, or you should certainly have an idea of what the market is doing, right? For sure, that just shows a lot of maturity in the development in your developer. But you know, publishers want to see a developer working on things. They're gonna either got specialities. If you're making a top-down RPG, and then your next game you're pitching as a shooter, that's going to raise some eyebrows, right? So
it's okay because it's a battleground shooter.
Exactly. So just kind of, you need to show that passion, right? But we can get on to you know, how to pitch and stuff in a bit. But
I'd love to talk about that now, actually.
Well, because that sounds very, you know,
it's going to be big. Yeah, okay. We'll get to it in a sec.
We have other practices, like this is where we kind of identified other areas to kind of branch out, which I don't think necessarily the other agencies do, is kind of distribution, which we see a lot more of these days because developers, clients are kind of can fund their own games, so they're released, you know, perhaps on Steam, and so we can help through our network find partners for different territories or different platforms, like bringing it to console, getting the game into Asia. You know, we have a Japanese office, and we also have a Hong Kong based office, and so they maintain a lot of those contacts.
Yeah.
And, you know, getting the game into Asia is it's not problematic, but there's a lot of pitfalls, right?
It's not straightforward, yeah.
You need to maintain those contacts even more than probably the West, right? Because it's all about building trust, and also in China there's the government approval process, which can be problematic for sure. So we can certainly help bring a game to other platforms and territories. And then we also have an industry guidance practice, which isn't necessarily just about the games industry. It's about helping other industries either get into the video games industry if they've identified that as a sector they want to get into, or just kind of advise, right, as well, and consult some groups outside of the industry, and that's kind of
so you probably get kind of, for that kind of thing, like pulled into kind of like country level stuff, like reports and things like that, where people are doing
a lot of competitive analysis or business sector analysis, stuff like that. In the past we've helped set up you know, publishers, actually, just kind of, you know, being hired to consult, also working with movie studios to maybe set up a games division, or providing them with a level of insight so they can then effectively you know, plan their strategy as to how best to approach the games industry. So cool. Yeah, sorry about that. It was just
no, it's good to get an overview of the kind of stuff you're working on. I do want to ask about specifically pitching to publishers, because that's something everyone probably who's tuned in now needs to think about if they're doing something commercial, and even if they're not pitching to a publisher, a lot of the things you need to do there transfer right over in terms of marketing your project, your game to the public and to the press, I feel. So like there's a very similar core set of things you should do or can do better that sure. transfer.
Well, in the past, it's kind of, developers were notorious shy or wouldn't really want to get out there so much. And I think it's certainly changed. You have a lot more celebrities, right, and personalities in the industry. And that can help you. That can also backfire to a certain extent.
So,
but I think you need to
just be as controversial as possible.
Well, exactly. And don't use social media so much. But it's about building, communities when you look at social media, not necessarily courting controversy, but I think there should be someone, either it's the kind of studio head, or it's the creative director, or someone that can project themselves well and communicate the project or the studio in a pretty decent manner, because it's a visual medium, right? And so it's it's expected to at least you're going to be kind of either pitching to a publisher, or if it's something that you're going to promote yourself, then social media or YouTube, or just engaging a community, right?
You see a lot of pitches, I'm imagining, and then you take some on and work with people. What is the easy mistakes, worst things to do in a pitch where you're putting together an explanation of a new project and you want a publisher to partner with you, maybe to provide funding? What's easy things to get wrong?
It's easy not to be prepared or know what to expect, right? If you've never been to a trade show like GDC or Gamescom, then it's very easy not to know how much of a kind of intense few days it can be, right? A lot of our clients will have back-to-back meetings with publishers pitching. So
for 1 or 2 days back-to-back, basically.
It's a lot of, you need a lot of stamina, right? And you need to be switched on. You need to know where you're going, where the meetings are taking place, what times. You need to have everything charged up, relevant cables needed. There's nothing worse than booting up a laptop that's out of battery, or whatever you're going to be pitching on isn't going to just die on you, right? Or even if it does, that pitch by heart, right? And you can present it like it wasn't the TV laptop wasn't even there. So it's important to just kind of, it's hard once you've done it once or twice, you know what to expect, and that's you just learn by doing, right? But not being too reserved and shy. A publisher is kind of investing in you as well, right? It's not just the pitch. Obviously, that's very important, but team, and they want to believe that you can develop and deliver on your promise. And
culturally, certainly in Ireland, I imagine in the UK as well, compared to, say, your typical American, that we're quite self-deprecating. It's easy to put our own things down, say, "Oh, it's all right," rather than "This is going to be the best game ever."
Yeah, I think they're habits to kind of unlearn, really. Obviously, you can be humorous, that's for sure, in a meeting, but you kind of got to believe in your studio, in the project, right? Never ever badmouth other publishers, developers, or anything like that. That's a big kind of turn off. Be respectful, and obviously you can reference other projects and studios, but it's about you and it's not about anyone else. And it's a small industry, everyone talks, you never know when it's gonna come back and bite you, right? Being passionate, going back to a publisher being investing in you, it's I worked with a very small indie studio. This is pretty much a good prime example of them not ever doing anything like pitching at a big trade show, right? They'd made a few small browser games, they had an interesting indie title, and we, partnered with them, got them all these meetings lined up. And although, at times it was a bit, but they still rehearsed, right? They spent a lot of time rehearsing the pitch, going through it, filming it, listening back to it. But one thing that came through was passion, enthusiasm from the main creative director there. It was her project, and everyone just kind of fell in love with her, right? And the concept was good as well. It wasn't as if it was just her.
Sure.
But when you kind of get someone like that, who's enthusiastic, it's kind of almost half the battle. And there's publishers in particular, if they're an indie publisher, or that's exactly what they want to look for. They want to look for a client a developer that they can kind of get behind, work with long term, and they can believe in, and then maybe they work on the next game together and build the studio up as a partnership. Publishers aren't all that bad. I think we're kind of starting to get out of that mindset that they're evil corporations. Publishers, I think it also it probably pays to just learn a bit about what a publisher actually does, because if you ever self-published a game, you know how difficult that is, right? And how distracting. If you're a small team and you're a creative guy, but you have to self-publish, then that can really take you away from the creative process, and you're really occupied with a lot of just mundane stuff, right?
I think in a team of 4 or 5 people, it's probably one person's full-time job to do all the stuff.
Absolutely.
Marketing and publishing.
So there's that, and obviously the pitch itself has got to be compelling, right? It's got to have, be super clear what the hook is. What is the main
Let's talk about that. What's a hook?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, why is the game going to be awesome, right?
Why should anyone care?
Why should I care about that game? Why are you the team to make that game?
Example of a good hook? Super hot.
It's worth noting that a hook is not your key pillars, right? And I'll get into what key pillars are. But a hook is, I suppose, if you look at Uncharted, right? What makes that awesome? I think it's probably the kind of feeling, the empowerment you get, feeling like a complete...
You're basically
at the seat of your pants.
You're in an action hero movie, basically.
Yeah, there's not one thing. All the animation working together makes it seamless, like Batman as well, right? The Arkham series. I suppose that is you being a silent predator, you feeling like Batman, like no other game before, right? That's kind of its hook, is we're going to make you feel super powerful, and it does feel great to play, right? So something like that, I guess. And then if you look at the key pillars, that would then be, the kind of underlying skeleton of your game. They all link together, and they should kind of inform what the game is going to be throughout all of its production, throughout the pitching. It's stuff like, right, we're going to have a wonderful universe. We're going to have this key mechanic, whatever that might be. Take God of War, it's kind of like the brutality, right? The combat system, and the way the camera changes its angles to make the action and reinforce that brutality further, right? And maybe the lore, the kind of mythology that kind of at the time was probably not that prevalent, right? So having a clear and concise key pillar.
So
sets of key pillars.
The hook, I sometimes think, is kind of like it's important for marketing, for standing out, and the pillars would be more for gameplay.
The hook is easy. You can easily get tied down with it's only branding or marketing jargon that the publishers will want, just so they can bandy that about. But it's important as well to distill it down, right? Everyone, like a good elevator pitch is something that you should be able to. Your game should be summed up in just a few lines or a minute, right? Because sometimes you have a minute to pitch your game, and so just having it down, knowing exactly what your game is. Use comparisons, use films or TV, or get other games. Just say it's such and such and this, and we're using this and that. There's a good Brian Upton. If you look on GDC Vault, I think it will be in there.
Great talk from last year. Yeah. It's like 30 mistakes in pitching your game, something like that.
Exactly that. That's I recommend that to anyone, because that, although it's one person's opinion, he would have seen tons of pitches. So
I watched that one. It's really good.
and I can vouch that that's pretty much everything he listed in that is what I would recommend you do or not do, right?
So what about when to pitch? So let's say you're starting a new project. You know what you're making, so you can answer those questions like what's the hook and what are the main pillars and what's the minute-to-minute gameplay and who's the team, that kind of stuff. But how far along should you be? Should you have built something?
Go back to minute, that's another very important thing that you need to have, right? You need to know what you're going to be doing from
what the player does.
Next, right?
Yeah.
You might have this grand vision, but someone might go, well, I don't actually understand what the gameplay is, what you're doing. And you're like, actually, yes. So having what the player will be doing from 1 minute to the next and 1 hour to the next is very important, right? Just to kind of be able to visualize that experience a bit more.
And answering that forces you, the designer, to actually think about commonplace things, which are easy to abstract away. It's just going to be a role-playing game rather than actually thinking about what you do.
Exactly. And some good examples are, from what I've seen from playing games of late, a lot of the narrative-based games which are coming out with mature themes, or they're doing something interesting with their narrative and characters. That's good, but then they're not necessarily fun to play, right? And it can be a bit of a slog, to get through the game. So, prime example is, Uncharted. I know it's a big game, but you can still take the learnings that its pacing is spot on, right? Because there's often a lot of ups and downs, right? It'll kind of slow down and then it'll peak again. So getting that right balance, it all depends on the genre as well, of course, but it's important to have a good balance of...
So let's say we were pitching Uncharted to Sony. In the minute-to-minute gameplay, would we be saying it's all action, or would we be saying it's interspersed action with moments that heighten the feeling of the action later?
Yeah. A lot of it is exploration or kind of traversing, and then there's pockets of combat, right? Which I'm sure you can look at it, and there's probably some kind of pattern they have when they have, right, we're going to have a big combat scenario now, we're going to have it's going to calm down, then we're going to have this massive set piece where he's scrambling off a helicopter that's crashing into the side of a mountain. Yeah. Then it slow downs again. We've got some puzzles. It's kind of...
And then you come to a whole new area and you start over again. Yeah.
Yeah. So, going back to the kind of when you should pitch, it's an easy trap to fall into, pitching too late, right? So if if you're coming to the end of a project, it's way too late, because if you've got, you're running out of money. Obviously, if your cash reserves are fine, then you've got a bit of time. But what most people don't realise is to sign a project, it can take anywhere probably more, right?
Sorry, that just cut out. To sign a project can take...
From pitching to contract can take anywhere between 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
So it's pretty significant amount of time. Certainly, if you're looking to secure a decent amount of dev funding and you're not able to do it yourself, then that's kind of the time frame you're looking at. So that is a long time to survive when you're not getting paid. And
that's one of the mistakes Brian Upton brought up in that talk was... we need a publisher because we're out of money. That's like a really bad reason to be pitching. Absolutely. You should be pitching, we need a publisher because we can work, because you need this project because it's so good, rather than we're screwed.
Yeah. So, you're looking at months before you need another project. That's when you should start pitching. Even it's always worth having an idea. Either you're maintaining 2 projects at a time. I know that's difficult if you don't want to grow the studio too much, but certainly having a concept that you're kind of working on in the background is wise. And so
a very good idea. Yeah. So you're ready to go, kind of.
Yeah, but we've seen over the last few years, we've seen a lot of change with how to pitch a game. Obviously, there's things you need, like a solid pitch deck, Art Bible,
Let's talk about pitch deck just for a second, and Art Bible. Those are both interesting. Pitch deck would be covering all the key things, some of which we mentioned there, like what is the 1 minute elevator pitch, what's the hook, what are the general pillars of the game. So it's kind of a step-by-step spelling out everything in a pitch, and it's in essentially a PowerPoint deck.
Yeah, or
or a document?
PowerPoint. We tend to work with clients that will build it in a PowerPoint, and then they'll maybe format it to a show. So it's kind of, it presents as soon as you open it, or a PDF as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, essentially it's got to have, your key data. So it's kind of just the boring stuff like budget and time frame, maybe some comparables, things like that. But I like to kind of recommend starting with an overview of the story, or the setting. Doesn't have to be loads about it, but just kind of setting up what the game is about, where it's set, if it's character driven, who are the main characters, right?
But probably at this point you don't want to go too heavy into story, right?
No, not at all.
So but just a little suggestion. We've thought this over, and here's the top level info. And
obviously, if it's not super important to your pitch, then you don't really want to bring too much attention to it. But majority of pitches will have quite an interesting universe or premise, right, or character. Before that, obviously you can have the elevator pitch or the tagline, and then tend to go into just a kind of overview of the hook.
On tagline and hook, this comes up a lot. So you even mentioned it there. Think of TV shows or other games that this is referencing. So it's like Stranger Things meets Tetris. I don't know. So let's make that game. But something like really good reference points for the person on the other side.
Parables as well, right? That just kind of gives them a good point of reference, so they kind of get it. I'm kind of prepared now. So
like, and topically, interesting games as well are good. So like, it's Battlegrounds, but we do X. You've probably seen 100 of those pitches in the last few months.
Plenty of those.
Yeah, just because they're so popular right now that people, developers are looking at why and trying to do their twist on it. But I also imagine publishers are really interested in it because they're looking at the success of games.
They are, but then it becomes very competitive, right? Like, that's why a lot of big AAA publishers don't want to look at a shooter, because they've often got their own, right? Or it's a very competitive market, so very hard to make a dent unless you've got infinite resources and do a big got a lot of money to make something like that. So as you say, but you need to stand out, right? If you're going to say it's Battlefront meets such and such, then that's such and such.
Better be good.
Sorry, needs to be something pretty unique, because people just go, oh, it's another battle royale. Go, oh, what's going to make this different? Which puts you on the back foot right away, because then you really have to prove what it is. So sometimes it's better to be maybe not obscure that no one knows what the hell the game is you're talking or making comparison to, but just but pretty good.
But not necessarily
the
current hotness that is out. So maybe dig into things that are a little underserved. Is that useful? Or are they...
It's not really about being underserved or what's niche or what's not been commercially successful. It's kind of showing that you're a fan of games, games, what's out there. It's about how do those games really influence the game that you want to make, right? So kind of it goes a bit more than just a quick it's this meets this, it's kind of, it needs to make sense, and it needs to have some kind of bearing on the actual project that you want to make, right?
Okay, yeah, very interesting.
So yeah, the hook, I think you're looking at 20 slides maximum for a pitch, right? You don't want to get too bogged down. Obviously, if people are interested, then you can have more discussions or provide more materials if you've got it. But a good pitch deck should be like 20, if that, and that's probably, at the upper end anyway. And it needs to be visual, right? It really, it's a visual medium, and so if you can't afford to create original artwork, then find some really good, reference pieces. Don't just fill the pitch with a load of mediocre, crappy pieces of art.
But if you're going to spend money on anything, it's some concept art to kind of frame this pitch with. Because
it can really pique someone's interest. A simple piece, it could be one piece of art that's really provocative, and they're like, I get it, I'm drawn into this now.
Okay, cool.
Far from being signed, but that can make the difference, right?
So from that point of view, it sounds like that would be quite an early stage pitch where you've got the idea, you've done work on that, but you haven't really started building the game itself. If, for example, you just have some concept art as the only kind of actual work you're showing.
Yeah, and that's kind of bringing me on to a good point that, you know, how things have changed over the years is it's going more and more as the as mobile has gone, where people weren't really touching or funding mobile games unless you had a pretty advanced build, right, or something that you could demonstrate. And we've seen that loads over the last year in particular, that publishers have just become more reluctant to take risks on paper pitches unless you're a rock star developer or someone with a great pedigree and you know of games under your belt. That's, you know, going back to having a speciality or just being shit hot at doing, you know, certain types of games comes into play, because it is often down to you know, your previous game or your track record. And so it doesn't have to be super advanced, but, you know, we're seeing, you know, the requirement of a prototype or something visual, right, that is being shown along with the pitch deck.
So let's talk about prototypes then. This is great for certain kinds of games where you can prototype some small part of the game and it will immediately, you know, show something fun and show what's important about the hook.
Yeah.
You know, show some part of the hook or the pillars.
Absolutely.
But it's harder if you're making like a kind of a systems rich game. So like, okay, you probably couldn't pitch up with a prototype of Dwarf Fortress that would interest a publisher, or, you know, if you're making the new Divinity Original Sin game, like there's so many parts that make that interesting together that it would be very hard to have a playable prototype that was interesting, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly, you know, genres that are harder to pitch than others. Certainly RPGs, there aren't many, you know, an RPG, because they're very, you know, in-depth projects and or can be very expensive. So that's where, you know, your supporting materials come in. That's why you should have really, you know, some really good artwork to go and coincide with your prototype. If you're not able to, if you know what you're prototyping isn't visual, is more systems based, but that's where, you know, it's just a challenge. It's a good point, because
can past projects help there? Can you be like, we've
absolutely.
done 2 RPGs like this, so play those?
Because you're not really gonna, well, if you want to pitch to a publisher and get some money to make an RPG, then you need to have some kind of experience in the past, right? Making those games is very difficult to then just rock up not having any kind of experience or released anything in the past, right? So absolutely, if you're going to make something like that, or if you're going to make any game, you need to know how to make them, right? You need to have someone on the team that's competent and experienced. And that's one way of certainly getting over that fact of, you know, it's harder for us to prototype something, but we can demonstrate that we're able to build those systems because we've done it in this game, or, you know, something like it. We introduced it here, and we're going to then develop it into this, which is going to be so much better. But the groundwork has already been there. You know, the tech or the code's already kind of in place. Right.
Which do you think is the most important in terms of like getting a deal signed? So the pitch itself, the game concept, the team, like say their experience. Which one of those do you think is more important? Or sorry, there's actually a third one, or a prototype if they have one.
I think,
so prototype, team, or concept.
Depends on who you are, right, and how long you've been going for, and all those things. Because you can just rock up with a pretty cool, you know, your rock star or something, and people are like, yeah, I'm giving you my money to make the next one, right?
Sure.
But if you're quite a smaller, younger studio, then you can have a very good, compelling pitch, but if you're going to go and approach more traditional publishers, it's very difficult for them just to sign off on a paper pitch, right? So everything's kind of equal in a sense. Obviously you can fudge a good concept or a pitch, but don't have the team to deliver on it, right? And I'm sure a lot of publishers have experienced that in the past. They've been sold something and have had terrible experiences with that developer because they've not been able to. That's where you get canned projects from, or projects being delayed, right? So it's difficult to say, everyone. I think the prototype we're seeing is how you really take things to the next level, though. A publisher can go, I love the concept, but we really need to see this working, or we need to see something.
Do you see that often, like especially recently in the last year or two, where you'd be pitching to publishers and they'd be interested, like not saying no but also not saying yes, and you'd have to go back to them when you actually built part of it?
Well, even the publishers that say, yeah, we're interested, it still takes a good few months, a lot of back and forth, a lot of calls, a lot of iterating on the core design, or just trying to fully communicate the concept. Then they would obviously need to discuss it internally and explain to their group. That's why it's always better to meet in person, right? To pitch in person than sending an email or something. And that's obviously a good way to get an initial interest, but it can be, there's no substitute for actually being there and them seeing you pitch.
So for that kind of thing,
getting to the next level, there needs to be something that we often liaise with the business development guys, right? So they will inevitably have to then take it to their management or a group, a number of kind of, maybe it's head of production there, brand, marketing, whoever it might be, right? You also
need to make their job easy, right? So if you win over the one person you meet, you need them to win over management, board, whoever, someone else internally. What can you give them to help that?
Passion, right? Passion and a good concept at the end of the day. If they're into it and they get it, it needs to be. It can't be too convoluted, right? People need to kind of get it instantly. They need to know what. That's where the hook comes from, right? If they get the hook, it doesn't matter what the wrapper is. They can see how that hook can then be cool and fun to play, and to you need a champion, certainly from within a publisher, to really sell the game to his team, right, or his superiors. But we're definitely seeing prototypes being almost invaluable just to get to that next level, because their management will be like, I need a playable, or I'm not getting it, I need to see more. It could be a mock-up, it could be a trailer, it could be
video. Would that be?
Yeah, I think video is the next best thing, right? If you're not able to actually, if you can fudge it with some smoke and mirrors, you've got maybe a very early sort of working thing. But we've got one client that kind of does a visual benchmark video, right? And that does require a lot of art assets, and which is a bit more expensive. But if you've certainly got very good artists or an art team, you can put together a video that shows what the end products might look like, right?
So it's like the next step up from concept art. You're actually putting together a mock-up of gameplay, basically.
Obviously, it's not like final art, but it's certainly showing you if it's like a game based in a vibrant universe like Avatar or something like that.
Yes,
Then you can create this visual benchmark using, I don't know, Unreal Assets or something that will kind of really pique the interest. We see that as well if you can't make the actual playable prototype that publishers are able to get hands-on with, then certainly having a video. We don't see too many ripomatics, Back in the day when I was at Cody's, we'd see loads of ripomatics.
What's a ripomatic?
A ripomatic is what you kind of splice together, footage from film, TV, other games. But usually it's put to, a pumping metal or techno soundtrack or something, and it just kind of it gives the viewer a quick and easy insight into what the game is about. You know what I mean? It could be like The Matrix meets some hardcore manga. There's just lots of these different kind of. The good ones are they kind of flow like a trailer would, like a cinematic trailer.
Okay, so it's like a trailer from ripped film and games. Yeah, cool. Just to kind of.
it's not something that I see too much of these days, but I did see loads back in the day, and it can still, if you really don't have anything else, then it can still make an impact, right? And can kind of help communicate what the core essence of the game is, or the project concept.
Just before we get too far away from it, we've got a question here from Twitch, from Generally Speaking. For taglines, etc., is it okay to reference non-games media, or should you stick to games only?
No, not at all. A lot of people in the games industry love popular culture, geeky stuff, right? So TV, film, art. I wouldn't be too obscure, because people then go, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it does have to be the object of attack. For it to work at all, if you're referencing, it's got to be pretty well known. Yeah,
it doesn't have to necessarily be a game, for sure.
Okay, cool, good to know. Let's talk about maybe platforms. So something like the Switch has just come out. Everyone would be very keen to get on the Switch, and probably, I'm guessing, publishers are looking at things that are novel and new for platforms in that way. And we were talking about battle royale games before. They've become big on certain platforms. Is that something you should consider?
You should definitely know what's in the market, right? If you're going to enter into a certain area, genre, you need to know what's going down, what's happening, what are the kind of main games in that space, and what are the up and coming games, because you'll be competing against them, and that's what the publishers will be looking at as well. They'll be like, well, why is this standing out? It's a very competitive market, why do we want to get in there? So obviously there's some publishers that will be like, we definitely want a battle royale esports game, you know what I mean? And there aren't many that will do that, but there's some, obviously. And as an agent, certainly that's one of our kind of,
you try and find that. Then
we know about that, and we can inform our clients that these guys are looking for such and such. Your concept can be that or very similar, and so that's how they become a viable target then. Whereas maybe if you're a developer just working away, you wouldn't necessarily get that exposure, right? But
the platforms themselves can also be sources of funding, right?
I think it comes down to a good concept at the end of the day. The game, if you're passionate, you believe in the concept, then a publisher can see value in that. I wouldn't let trends or, if you've got a super cool, I think it's pointless just going, I want to make that because it's popular, and you're not bringing anything new or different to the market, right? I think that's just a big turn off for publishers. It's like, why are you making it for? If there's nothing really new or interesting about it.
Yep. And it kind of goes back to the things we were talking about at the start, like a hook, if it's just copying someone else's highly popular game, isn't really that interesting.
Yeah. So obviously there's like VR.
Yeah, so VR is a really good example, because it's kind of like almost a gold rush of interest there.
Yeah, I don't think, but there aren't many traditional publishers funding. So if you're going to make a VR game, then and you need funding, there's a handful. There's the first parties that will maybe fund something, right? Or if you can self-publish, then yeah, I think you can do very well, because there aren't many games out there, and there's a need for content, and people that have bought those devices want to play good content, right? So I think it's like any if you can self-publish, you can fund yourself, then you're probably in a better position to make some money. But it's also, it's a risk, because Steam's getting like the App Store, the kind of exposure it's getting very hard to kind of stand out there now, when there's so many games being released each month. But I digress. But
well, actually, while we're talking about that, from the other point of view, you as a developer, let's say you have a great concept, great team, great pitch, people are interested. How should you be picking a publisher if you have a choice of several? So someone who's going to help you stand out and help you be successful.
I think, you need to look at the games they've released, right? You're not going to approach someone that makes sports management games with a battle royale game, right?
It's a sports battle royale game.
Exactly, yeah. So you need to have a good understanding of what they specialise in, right? And do a bit of research on them. Don't just rock up and cold call them, because then they're going to be like, well, you obviously don't really know what we make, and you don't really care. So why should I care, So be a bit more selective. It is difficult though, for sure, and that's, I think, having a business development guy internally or someone that can dedicate a bit of time to that is worthwhile, or working with an agency, of course. I don't want to do a sales pitch or anything, but having someone that can just be dedicated to business development, always not attending every show, but kind of out there speaking to people, getting recognized, getting familiar with the main sort of publisher groups, because there's always new publishers, there's new indie publishers, there's the Asian publishers, like Smallgate, or some of the bigger groups that may fund more than others. So just having a good understanding of who are the main players, not even who are the main players, but having a good overview of all various sizes and funding ranges of publishers are out there is super important, and that's something that DDM dedicates itself to. That's one of the big benefits to our clients, is that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to unearth and uncover as many opportunities as possible by meeting with publishers and meeting with the interesting funders and from other areas as well.
Well, what about alternate sources of funding? So crowdfunding,
investment, right?
Private investors.
Crowdfunding is very difficult. I think we've seen, if you look at Kickstarter, there's been a massive, downward spiral. There aren't many games being funded now on Kickstarter.
Unless you have a board game, but even that, I believe, may not be where it was.
But if you're looking at purely games, I think you really need to have either a kick-ass something about your team, or there's a personality or something about the individual that people can get behind. That's how you really kind of maximize your chances. But even then, it's very difficult, right? On Kickstarter, there are, and I'm not saying don't, but just be aware that it can be very difficult. And obviously, the higher you're asking, the budget you're asking for, the harder it becomes, right? I think if you look at funding ranges of successful games, it's probably a sweet spot as a few 100,000 or something, right?
Usually a fraction of the actual budget.
Yeah, exactly. But you can, if you've got a bit of funding, you can certainly use Kickstarter to generate some PR, right? Or build a community. That's a good way of doing it. If you want to maybe 50k or 100k or something, and then it's a good way to generate a bit of noise around your game in your studio within a community.
Yeah.
There's investors, I suppose. You see a lot more investment being granted. It's still difficult to secure investment, because you either need to have, the studio needs to be
harder than a publishing deal.
I don't know.
As hard, maybe.
Probably, because you don't get as many. I don't know. We're not too involved with the investment side of things, because we're not licensed to do that. But it can happen. But the groups that tend to get invested in, they've either got a super cool portfolio or track record, or there's something about the studio, right? They're made up of very experienced dudes or dudettes. Or the game, it's not necessarily about the game you're pitching to an investor. It's more about your long-term IP, the IP you own, or the studio itself, or your plans going forward.
Actually, IP is also a really interesting topic. So I believe at the higher end of funding from a publisher, so essentially the bigger proportion of money you need from a publisher, the more likely they will be owning the IP afterwards.
Absolutely.
How important is it as a independent company, do you think, to try and keep that somehow and find funding elsewhere, or bootstrap, or?
Depends on your focus as a studio, right? Your goals, if you want to kind of maybe get to a point where you're building value in the studio to gain investment or to sell or whatever, obviously that's how you good bunch of IP and stuff like that. It's hard to say, right? Before a game's made and released, there's an IP that there's no value to an IP.
Yeah. It's only worthwhile if it's successful, really.
Exactly, but I think publishers are certainly more open these days to because before it would be like, no way, we own the IP outright. That's the
starting point. Yeah.
I mean, whereas now
you mentioned indie publishers earlier, and that the kind of default way there would be more like they're your partner around launch, but they don't own your game.
Yeah, this is there's certainly more and more publishers that are going to be open to that, or that's not important to them because they want to build a long-term relationship with that developer, right? So it's in their best interests to have a good relationship so they can work on the next game together, and build that kind of rapport. And it's also building a kind of community as well, right? Sort of a dedicated fan base that loves your, because a lot of indie publishers will make a certain type of game, right? And so it's easier to sell to that market once you've established that kind of fan base. But going back to the prototyping, if you can put more and more money into production yourself, so you can get it to a certain point, then it becomes a lot easier to retain IP, right? Because if the development funding that you're asking for is equal to the amount that you've invested yourself, then it's hard for a publisher to go, we want to
we own it, yeah, because you're like, you've kind of co-invested,
yeah. Co-investment partnership or co-funding. So we see a lot more of that nowadays, and if they can't get the IP, then rev shares are definitely a lot more fairer than they used to be, right? Because it used to be kind of very, very low percentages that you could on the back once they've recouped and all that stuff, and then you're looking at the revenue the games is generating. That's when you start getting back end revenue, and so obviously if you put in quite a bit of money in, then you can get like 50% or something on the rev split. But it all depends on how much money you're putting in. It all depends on the publisher and if they're putting a lot into marketing. So there's a few factors.
Yeah.
But the IP is, yes, an interesting one, right? I think to developers,
because you often hear as a creator that the IP is the ultimate thing that has long-term value, but I also heard a really great counterpoint, which is that you can make new IP anytime you want.
Well, I think exactly. And if you're a creative studio, then you just want to make games, right? And I'm not saying you should just roll over and let them take everything. And if you see real value in that IP, right? If you feel really good about it, and you think there's you can do a lot more with it. You can bring it to other mediums like cartoons or comics or films or whatever it might be, then I think then, right, that there's value in that if you certainly believe in it and you just know.
Because there's certainly times are changing slightly in terms of like the kind of games you're making, and like upselling through, for example, loot boxes and season passes for expansions and stuff. Like the way games are being sold has definitely changed in the last 15 years, and I would say publishers are probably looking at franchises rather than just one-off projects.
That's kind of a bit of echo on your side.
Sorry, you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying that probably publishers are looking towards building franchises when they're looking at new products, like not necessarily one game, but like a lineage of games.
Bigger traditional publishers will certainly be looking at ways to continue to monetize a project for sure. Maybe not necessarily franchise, but certainly having games as a service type of mechanisms in place, right? So it's kind of keeping the player in their game for longer. So that's like either through regular content drops or updates, engaging, having a live team.
How important is it to include that in your pitch? Should you, like, you're pitching the game, should you also pitch the long tail of content? And I
think so, yeah, because single player games are they're not a dying breed, but
they're certainly getting more at risk.
It kind of limits who you're going to be able to pitch your game to, and there's certainly publishers out there that do like single player driven narrative experiences, right? Annapurna, for instance, with the game, some of the games they've made, like Edith Finch and stuff, which are wonderful games. And so there's certainly market for those, and I love those type of games as well. But I think the majority
they don't have many loot boxes. No. For example,
you find it difficult to see any in that game, but not necessarily loot boxes. I don't think you don't need to monetize the hell out of your game, but you certainly need to be aware of how the game can continue. So having some kind of online feature, having some kind of multiplayer
replayability, stuff like that. Yeah, but even figuring out if loot boxes were a thing, like, do they make sense with this game? Should we have them?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But obviously there's certain games that it makes more sense than other games, right? And I wouldn't say you know every game needs to have loot boxes or just like in-game purchases. It's more about how can you maintain a long-term engagement with and retain those users, right? After the initial release, there needs to be a dedicated live team that's monitoring all the feedback and tweaking stuff,
running events and making content.
It's a persistent world, right? You look at
Grand Theft Auto 5,
H1Z1 or whatever it is, they don't tend to necessarily have loot boxes, but they have a lot of loot and they have a lot of persistent systems and
new stuff. Yeah. Okay, cool. Tell you what, Matt, we'll leave it there. You've spent over an hour with us now chatting. That's really interesting, and thank you so much for coming along and giving your time.
My pleasure. I could chat for longer. It's always good to talk about games and stuff.
I've got one last question from chat. Would a publisher bother with a game that would not be a hit but rather has an average chance to make an average return? Because this is really interesting. Like, VCs look for the 100x return, and they kind of don't care if you just get 2x. You never know, right? For sure. It depends on a lot of things. If your studio's small, you can sell 50, 100,000 units, and that's going to do a lot for you, right? I don't think publishers ever set out to make crappy average games.
Not many games.
But I mean, if they see the upper limit isn't infinite.
They see there's publishers that just want to make cool original content. You look at Devolver, people like that make crazy cool games, right? Some of them sell very well, some probably not so much. Mm-hmm. Some of the kind of more art housey games probably aren't commercially successful, but publishers they're a business at the end of the day, so they don't want to make too much of a loss. I would never go into a pitch and say I'm going to make an average game.
No.
You know what I mean? It still needs to be cool, right? It needs to be some artistic merit in the game that you're making, and it's out of your hands sometimes whether it's going to be successful or not. You just never know, right? What's going to sell well or resonate with the audience.
Cool.
Just believe, man.
Just make an average battle royale game.
And if you're looking at doing competitive analysis, never look at the
outliers. Yeah. We'll just make an MMO half as good as World of Warcraft.
Yeah, you look at things that are kind of achievable, right? More realistic.
So eliminate the top 1 or 2 in the genre and look at the 3 through 10 is probably a better thing to aim for.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And thanks so much for your time, Matt. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll follow up and put this up on YouTube when it's ready in a few days. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.
Appreciate that, man.